The 17th maid walked out of the Whitmore mansion at exactly 9:42 in the morning, her suitcase banging against the marble steps, tears streaking down her face as she swore she would never set foot in that house again. Behind her, in the doorway, stood an 8-year-old girl in a silk nightgown, arms crossed, expression cold as winter glass, watching another grown woman crumble before her. This was Charlotte Whitmore, the only daughter of one of the wealthiest men in Connecticut, and in the span of 8 months she had broken 17 maids. Some quit in tears. Some quit in anger. One quit after Charlotte poured an entire bottle of expensive perfume into her purse and blamed her for stealing it. Nobody in that house believed an 18th woman would last more than a week. If this story moves something in you, if you believe people deserve second chances and that even the coldest hearts can be reached with patience, hit that like button, drop a comment below, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to the channel because stories like this one are just getting started. Her name was Margaret Doyle, and she arrived at the Whitmore estate on a gray Tuesday morning carrying nothing but a small canvas bag and a reputation the staffing agency had been reluctant to mention. She was 53 years old, widowed, with silver threading through her dark hair and hands roughened by decades of work most people never noticed until it stopped being done. She had raised 3 children alone after her husband died in a factory accident, buried her youngest son to leukemia when he was only 11, and survived a house fire that took everything she owned except the clothes on her back. By the time Margaret stood at the iron gates of the Whitmore mansion, there was very little left in the world that could frighten her, and certainly not an 8-year-old girl with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. The housekeeper who let her in, a nervous woman named Patricia, warned her quietly in the hallway before they even reached the girl's room. She told Margaret that Charlotte's mother had died in a car accident when the child was only 4, that her father, Richard Whitmore, buried his grief in boardrooms and business trips, leaving his daughter to be raised by a rotating cast of nannies, tutors, and maids who came and went like seasons. Patricia said the girl trusted no one long enough to let them stay, because everyone she had ever loved either died or disappeared behind a closed office door. Margaret listened, nodded once, and said only that she understood grief better than most people in that house ever could. The first confrontation happened before lunch. Charlotte stormed into the kitchen where Margaret was folding linens and announced, with the practiced cruelty of a child who had learned it from watching adults dismiss each other, that Margaret would not last a week like all the others, that she was old and slow and probably too stupid to keep this job anyway. Most of the previous maids had either scolded her, begged her, or run crying to Patricia. Margaret simply looked up from her folding, studied the girl's face for a long moment, and said that she had buried a son younger than Charlotte, and had cried more tears than this house had ever seen. So a little name-calling from a lonely little girl was not going to send her running anywhere. Charlotte's mouth opened, then closed, because for the first time in her short life, someone had not flinched. Over the following weeks, Charlotte tested Margaret the way she had tested every woman before her. She hid Margaret's belongings, spilled juice deliberately across freshly cleaned floors, screamed until her face turned red when she did not get her way, and once locked Margaret out on the back terrace in the rain for nearly an hour just to see what would happen. Margaret never raised her voice. She never quit. She dried herself off, changed her clothes, and returned to work as though nothing unusual had occurred, and each time, Charlotte watched from behind doorframes and curtains, waiting for the moment Margaret would finally break like everyone else had. That moment never came. Slowly, without either of them fully realizing it, something shifted. Margaret began sitting with Charlotte in the evenings when Richard Whitmore was traveling, which was most evenings, and instead of correcting her or lecturing her, she simply talked. She told Charlotte stories about her own children, about the son she lost, about the ache of losing someone you loved and not knowing where to put all that sadness so it did not swallow you whole. Charlotte, who had never once been asked how she felt about her mother's death, who had been handed toys and tutors and expensive distractions instead of comfort, found herself listening. One night, curled on the window seat of her enormous, lonely bedroom, she asked Margaret in a small voice whether the sadness ever went away. Margaret told her the truth, that it does not disappear, but it changes shape, and eventually you learned to carry it without it crushing you, and that she was not carrying hers alone anymore because people had helped her, and she intended to help Charlotte the same way, whether the girl liked it or not. The change was not immediate, and it was not without setbacks. There were still tantrums, still cruel words hurled in moments of fear disguised as anger, still nights when Charlotte tested whether Margaret would finally give up on her the way everyone else eventually had. But Margaret stayed. She stayed through the fevers when Charlotte was sick and no one else came to sit by her bed. She stayed through the school recital that Richard Whitmore missed because of an overseas meeting, clapping loud enough in the third row that Charlotte could hear her over every other parent in the auditorium. She stayed through the anniversary of her mother's death, when Charlotte refused to leave her room, and instead of forcing the door open, Margaret simply sat on the floor outside it for 6 hours, talking softly through the wood until Charlotte finally opened it, and collapsed into her arms, sobbing years of buried grief into a stranger's shoulder because that stranger had become the closest thing to family she had left. Richard Whitmore, for all his wealth and all his distance, was not blind forever. He began noticing the changes in his daughter the way a man notices sunlight after a long winter, gradually, and then all at once. Charlotte started eating dinner without being forced. She stopped screaming at the household staff. She began leaving small drawings on Margaret's pillow, crayon pictures of 2 figures holding hands under a yellow sun, and once, taped to the refrigerator, a drawing labeled simply as her family, with 3 figures instead of 2. Richard found that drawing one evening after another failed business trip, and something in his chest cracked open. He asked Margaret to sit with him in his study, a room she had never once been invited into, and he asked her, with the exhausted honesty of a man who had spent years running from his own grief, what she had done that 17 other women could not. Margaret told him the truth. She said that children do not need someone who is perfect, or wealthy, or even endlessly patient. They need someone who will not leave, someone who stays through the ugliness until the ugliness runs out, and what is left underneath is a frightened child who only ever wanted to be loved without conditions. She told him that Charlotte was not spoiled, she was starving, and that money had never once been able to feed a hungry heart. Richard sat in silence for a long time after that, and when he finally looked up, there were tears in his eyes that he did not bother to hide. Please, before we finish this story, take just a moment and type the word kindness in the comments below if you believe love and patience can heal even the deepest wounds, because I want to know how many hearts this story has touched today. In the months that followed, something changed in that enormous, echoing house that money alone had never been able to buy. Richard began coming home earlier. He started tucking his daughter into bed himself, some nights sitting beside Margaret as she told the same old stories that had once cracked open a lonely little girl's frozen heart. Charlotte, who had once made grown women weep and flee, grew into a child who hugged Margaret every morning before school and waited by the window every afternoon for her to come home from the market. The staff who remained in the house began to whisper that the mansion finally felt less like a museum and more like a home, and at the center of that transformation was a widow who had walked through her own fire and come out the other side with nothing left to fear. Margaret never asked for recognition, never expected gratitude beyond the small drawings taped to refrigerator doors and the tight arms wrapped around her neck each night. She had simply given a broken little girl what every child, rich or poor, truly needs, which is someone who refuses to walk away. If this story touched your heart even a little, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who might need reminding today that love, patience, and a little bit of unshakable courage can heal wounds that no amount of money ever could. And don't forget to subscribe, because there are so many more stories like Margaret and Charlotte's still waiting to be told.